Let's talk to Jonathan Alter, the historian who's written the book on the former US president called his very best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. Jonathan, welcome. How should we remember Jimmy Carter?
Well, I think we should remember him as a man of peace and a tremendous advocate for human rights around the world, who was a much better president, doesn't deserve to be on Mount Rushmore, you know, our monument out west, but he was a much better president than a lot of people assume. And of course, he was an inspiring former president who redefined what former presidents of the United States are capable of. I think it's quite interesting that you're focusing on China, because when I was interviewing President Carter, which I did on many occasions in preparing this book, I heard from him that he considered normalization with China to be his longest lasting accomplishment. And remember, he was responsible for the most durable peace treaty since World War II, the Camp David Accords. But he thinks normalization is more significant in the larger sweep of history. So Richard Nixon opened the door to China in 1972, but Jimmy Carter and Deng Xiaoping walked through it in 1979. And that, it kicked off, it made possible the greatest economic growth in human history. When Deng Xiaoping returned to China from his trip to Washington in 1979, the first thing he did was legalize private property, allowing China to prosper, and a number of other reforms that came directly out of normalization. So this was a huge deal that most people have forgotten.
Jonathan, you met him many times. What was he like on a personal level?
Well, he was a tremendously bright person and a very curious person with many talents. He could be charming, extremely charming in person and in small groups, less good as a communicator in front of on television. But in person, it would alternate between a kind of an intensity that characterized him, a real friendliness and warmth, and then on other occasions, he could be a little bit snappish. And this is very much in keeping with his relationships with other people. So this idea that, he was some kind of a saint, I think needs some revision, but the real revision needs to be on the idea that he was a weak failure, which is what the right wing in the United States for many years tried to depict him as.
Was he a better former president than a president?
Well, only if you judge things politically. So yes, he was a more successful former president than president, but what people have to keep in mind is that former presidents don't really have any power. And as president, he was a political failure. He was beaten badly by Ronald Reagan in 1980. But he was a substantive and often visionary success. And, we've talked about Camp David and China, but there are many other accomplishments, especially on the environment. And, he was the first leader anywhere in the world to talk about climate, and he wanted electric vehicles by the mid-1980s. He signed 15 major pieces of environmental legislation. So this idea that, he wasn't any good as president is really a reflection of the fact that he had a very bad economy when he was president, and the hostages didn't come home until just moments after he left office, but he negotiated their release successfully. So I think that he was both a much underappreciated president and an inspirational former president.
Jonathan, good to talk to you. Thank you for that. Jonathan Alter, the historian, reflecting on the life and times of US President Jimmy Carter, who's died at the age of 100.